Good morning, everybody. Professor Wasser here. This is going to be a re-recording of the Existentialism and Kierkegaard lectures. We're going to do this in two parts, basically, because I found it's easier for students to kind of digest one part and move into the next part. It also kind of gives you a little bit of breathing space between the reading, and the lecture, the slides, and whatnot. So that's how we're going to operate. This is also, as I mentioned, a re-recording because apparently there was some, let's say, technological interference with the last recording. Apparently, it just picked up nothing but the audio, and it just kind of kept all this, all the slides from being recorded. So, like I said, this is a re-recording, and I apologize for any inconvenience that causes. That said, you do have some reading to do before this is going to be posted, so hopefully that's not an issue for you. Okay, so with that being said, let's go ahead and get this started. Okay. Hey, outstanding. This is working right out of the gate today. This is something that I'm not used to seeing work right out of the gate. So, like I said, we're going to be starting off with the fundamental question. Why are we starting with existentialism? And if you recall, last week we read William Barrett's Irrational Man, Chapter 6, Flight from Lapida, right? There's a very particular reason I had you read Chapter 6. Because it really demonstrated the movement away from the romanticism of previous generations towards the more existential view that characterizes contemporary humanity. Okay. In all fairness, and this is what William Barrett might say, the existential attitude is the attitude of humanity as we are now. And in my view, I don't think it's an attitude that we're poised to move beyond in any immediate future, right? Even with the age of technology and the screen age, as we're being called now, immediately upon us, it's not self-evident that the three A's of modernity are going to be alleviated anytime soon. So real quick, I want to go ahead and type these out here. Let's see if I can get this going. Notes from the notes that will appear here. If we go into the chat, right, I want to say there's three things I want you to pay attention to, folks, okay? And that is what we're going to call the three A's of modernity, okay? And that's atomization, alienation, and anomy. Now, like I said, I've posted these in the chat, okay? So please go ahead and take a look at that. Yeah, those are not actually from existential philosophy, so to speak. They're actually from modern literary theory, but they're definitely related to what we're going to be talking about here over the next couple of slides, days, and thinkers, okay? And if we think about atomization, alienation and anomy, what they mean, I think you're going to really kind of agree with Barrett and the existential philosophers in the sense that, well, those things are things that we're still dealing with. We're going to get to those in a moment, okay? So let's kind of move forward. Now, the question is what is existential philosophy, and why am I really hammering on this idea of existential philosophy as opposed to existentialism, right? Existentialism is a term coined by one Jean-Paul Sartre. And if you go further into the existential, let's say, philosophy tree, you will read Sartre. In this class, we won't because this is not an existentialism course. Okay. But that particular philosophy was relegated to him and him alone. Okay. Existential philosophy is a larger tree of philosophers, a larger lineage of philosophers who are all looking at a series of similar themes, okay, that connect them, although they're not all looking at those themes in the same kind of way, or they might not even look at the same kind of themes, not even in the same way. They might look at them completely differently, okay, and that has some certain, let's say, it has a certain impact on the way the whole kind of discipline, if you will, not that it's a discipline, is approached. Okay, so there's a fundamental aim, I would say. Okay, each one of the existential philosophers is concerned with looking to kind of understand how every extant being exists, right? And when I say extant being, I mean each individual identifiable being, right? So you are an extant being, right? You exist. You are here, and you are here now, right? The existential philosophers are very concerned with how those particular beings, for better lack of words, be. It's a very grammatically incorrect way of saying that, but perhaps that's the most existentially correct way of saying it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and there we go. That way you don't got to see my ugly face talking during this entire thing. Okay. Now the question is given that this is not a concrete discipline, right? What does that have to? What effect does that have? Actually, I find that it's actually harder for me to lecture that way. Okay, well, we're learning here, folks. Okay, given that this isn't a concrete discipline, what does that actually have to do with this? What is that? What effect does that have on existential philosophy? Well, first of all, it means that we're going to have a disparate range of theories, each dealing with one of these themes. Okay, and a lot of these themes might actually then contradict from one thinker to the next. And in fact, that's why we're going to read Kierkegaard this week. We're going to read Nietzsche next week, because they're both thinkers that are looking at the exact same problem, right? How does the individual exist in a world where God, at least as the unifying theory, the unifying truth, is no longer there in the sense that it used to be? How does the individual exist, right? And they both have very similar, albeit different answers for the same problem. Okay, so that's the first thing. So I want you to be paying attention to that. There's going to be these wide range of theories about how that individual should exist. You're also going to notice that there's going to be a heavy emphasis on language. Okay, my classes in general, there's a heavy emphasis on language. Okay, because I do come from the existential, let's say, tradition, the continental tradition of philosophy. Okay, but we need to start paying attention to the words that we use, because, folks, words, they're not just utterances. We don't just use them frivolously. And I think if you think about that a little bit harder than you normally would, you'll understand that words are kind of a tool that we use to express or to make external the experience we have of the world that we inhabit, right? What that means is that, okay, if a thinker uses a word in a particular way, if a thinker uses a word in a way that's somehow different than we're used to, there's probably a reason for that. So, for instance, Martin Heidegger was very, very frequently, I'll put these down in the chat, right? He would frequently use words instead of being. Second. So being would frequently, how would I do this? No, that's not, there we go. There we go. Being could equal being, or, he would write things like, and I'm just going to try to use a shorthand there. So being would equal being with a Y, or being with a hyphen. He used different phrases to kind of signal, being itself as opposed to the being of beings. Like, for instance, being of this mug right here, or the being of this, remote control right here. Okay. I think, if you think about that, that does make sense, that there is being itself, and then there's the being of beings, right? And so we'd use, let's say, linguistic markers to kind of identify that. This whole linguistic turn is also going to make us start thinking about things like no thing, right? Or the nothing. Like, and this is going to be a question that perhaps could ruin your night if you think about it too hard. Is nothing a thing? There's a real serious question there. And in fact, it relates to the philosophical question that kind of sits at the heart of my intellectual activities, which is, well, why are there things instead of no things? So, okay. We were also going to be talking about concepts like world. Now, in a couple of weeks, we're going to be dealing with a very important thinker by the name of Parmenides. Parmenides is a monist, which we're going to get to that definition here in a couple of weeks. But what you need to understand is that, okay, well, what exactly constitutes a world? Is a world just a physical, tangible thing, right? Well, that's just a globe, isn't it? Or a body. Like, what constitutes a world? And we know that we speak about world differently than other things because, well, you hear it all the time. You ever hear someone say, well, it's your world, boss, what does that mean? Let's not just chalk that up to some semantic difference between speakers, right? There's probably something there, right? And we're also going to get into notions of time and change, right? What exactly does time mean? And if time isn't something, right? Because time doesn't seem to be a thing, right? What is it? And how does that affect, excuse me, things? Oh, pardon me. That's terrible. That's what I get for coming from the gym, right? So, okay. Okay. So the question is, where did existentialism start? Now, it's easy to point to contemporary history as the, let's say, origin of existential philosophy. And in fact, I say in a literal perspective, if I'm pointing to the exact moment where existentialism started or existential philosophy started in a literal sense, I point to the poetry of Friedrich Hölderlin, right? Who remembers that library lecture series from last semester knows that. I point to him as a kind of a precursor to, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and all of them, right? But the fact of the matter is that it starts way before that. Because remember, existential philosophy is concerned with really how the individual exists, right? What it is to exist as an individual. And if that's the case, then to say that we've only begun doing that in the, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries is ridiculous, right? People have probably been considering what it means to be an individual for as long as we've been considering ourselves. But the fact of the matter is that the ability to write that down, right? And then the opportunity to have that written down thing be maintained, that's probably highly, you know, that's just not exactly a normal thing. And in fact, if we really think about it, the only people who had that opportunity to do that were were the priests, right? Were the, basically the educated classes of society, throughout history. So if we look at it, the first real opportunity to kind of pay attention to the weirdness of reality came with the scholarly classes, right? And the first notable version of that was Father Tertullian. Tertullian was he wasn't a Catholic priest, but was a priest who was very interested in what we would consider to be the paradoxical nature of reality. And paradox is very important in philosophical inquiry because paradox, for better lack of words, is at the heart of what it means to be a human. I mean, if you think about it, we are at all times beset by the paradoxes of human, the paradoxes of humanity beset us at all sides, right? I mean, we're always concerned with, being an individual, but we're always concerned with being a species creature, right? We're always concerned with social justice, but we're always concerned with justice for myself, right? Paradox, the confluence of two interdependent ideas, or the intersection of two seemingly competing ideas, is always there. I mean, there's the concept of homo duplex. How we exist at two separate planes of existence at the same time. This is all paradoxical. And the first person to really kind of identify this was Tertullian, who noted that in Christian theology, and theology back then was considered the way of life, was highly paradoxical. Here's the quote: "The Son of God was crucified, and the Son of God died. It is by all means believed because it is absurd. He is buried and rose again. The fact is certain because it is impossible." Right? These are Christian dogmas, but they're held to be true because of the absurdity, right? The faith, the interiority was what was mattered most there. Okay. I think the most salient existential text in terms of the original existential texts was Augustine's Confessions. Okay, Augustine was another priest who was very concerned with existential matters. In fact, he might be construed as the first real existential thinker, as opposed to a teleological thinker, because he was concerned in Confessions with what I am. Right. Prior to that, and again, we're going to go to the chat here. Right. Most thinkers were teleological. And telos, which is the primary word there, is a word that you're going to want to become familiar with. If you had English class with me before, you know that telos means purpose. Okay, so if prior to Augustine, you had a teleological framework of the world, you had a purpose-driven framework of the world. You thought that there was a divine watchmaker, and that you were created in such a way that you had a purpose because of that creation, right? Well, Augustine is not convinced of that. And he starts looking at himself as a, let's say, self-driven wheel, Nietzsche might say, right? A self-propelled wheel. And his Confessions are his examination of that. So right there, we can already see how, and this is only a couple hundred years into the modern age, or in the modern epoch, that, people are beginning to wonder, what it means to be myself. What am I, as opposed to what is a human, which is the question that predominated a lot of thought of antiquity. Okay. Now I promised you guys we'd get here, and here's the slide. There are some themes, and you notice I'm trying to screw this up too. I kind of put it under existentialism, right? It should be existential philosophy. Okay. I would like to go through the themes first. I'm going to list them off. We're going to talk about a couple of slides after this. Okay. But I do want to talk about these two quotes. And I think these two quotes really, really do kind of embody, even if it's not necessarily related to Nietzsche, the existential philosophy kind of credo, if you will. Okay. So the first theme is primacy of the individual, what we might otherwise know as atomization. So remember, we said the three A's of modernity were atomization, alienation, and anomy, right? So let's kind of go back to that. I'm going to go here and I'm going to kind of reply with quote. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so atomization is pretty simple, folks. The atom is the smallest unit that we could measure at the time of the molecular structure. So basically, it was looking at the smallest unit of humanity. Okay, so it's looking at the individual human. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put these in here. Alienation, the sense of being alone. Okay. There, so we can talk about these things as they come up. Okay, so I've got these preset in our chat box. Okay, so yeah, primacy of the individual, folks. Now, first of all, being an individual is great in a certain sense, but it also means paying attention to yourself in an alienated sense, right? If you are an individual, then you are not part of a group, right? You are yourself. Okay, and that carries with it, geez, I'm sorry, a couple of problems, right? The first, and this relates directly to number two, which is that if you're an individual, then you are free. Okay, but if you're free, and this is again Jean-Paul Sartre, then you're ultimately responsible. The question here is, how much responsibility, how much freedom do we actually have in reality? And that's an important question moving forward. Okay, it's going to be something that's going to tie this course into ethics, and it's going to be something that's going to tie this course into other courses like 152, where we talk about life, death, and dying. How do we really live a life, right? By the way, I want to make it clear that most people, Sartre would say this in Nausea, that most people are terrified of freedom, right? And most people don't really want to be free. The third point is the pursuit of meaning. What is meaning? What does it mean for anything to really mean anything, right? And that's important, folks. It really is, because we presume things that have meaning, but do they, right? If that's the case, then how do we differentiate things? How do we kind of actually evaluate things? And that's going to tie into that whole, like I said, axiological philosophy problem. Like, what does it mean to value anything? We're talking about change and transcendence. One of the things that we're going to talk about with Nietzsche is self-overcoming, self-Überwindung, right? Which is basically, the idea that you aren't the final form of yourself. If you're into Pokemon, that's a good reference we could pull out here, which is how you become your ultimate form, right? Death and anxiety, right? Folks, the fact of the matter is that I think it's a fact of the matter, excuse me. I've posited in my own philosophies that without death, right, nothing would have any meaning, right? But at the same time, death kind of prompts a certain kind of anxiety in us that is implacable and impossible to get beyond. Now, the question is, what do we do with that? If we know that death is coming, right? How do we respond to it? By the way, that's also very much Martin Heidegger. Okay, authenticity. Authenticity is another theme that's going to be coming up here in the next couple of weeks, and you need to think about that. Is that a term that's just basically thrown out there to kind of get people to think in a certain way? Or is it a real thing? Can we ever really, truly ever be authentic? Alienation and anomy. Now, I brought this up before. Alienation means you're made foreign. Well, folks, the fact of the matter is that we live in a society that is very, very adept at alienating us. In every given term, we're very good at alienating ourselves, right? How? Why? Well, let's look at it this way. Um, you know, you go to work for a job, you know, it pays you less than perhaps you might like, you don't feel connected to the work that you're doing. That's a form of alienation, right? Anomie, like I said in the chat box, anomie means the sense of listlessness. How many of you felt directionless? This is your first year of college. You're supposed to be feeling excited about this. I'd be willing to bet that more than one of you have had this moment where you don't exactly feel great about what you're doing, right? And then lastly, this idea of temporality or finitude, all very important themes. Now, I said I wanted to talk about these two quotes right here, okay? And the reason I bring them up is because one, they're very provocative, and two, they kind of, let's say, harmonize these themes together into a general sense. And I think they do speak to most of the people that are going to fit underneath the existential tree. The first one is nobody's more inferior than those who insist on being equal. I believe that's from Beyond Good and Evil. Um, Nietzsche's in 2026. It's very weird. It's very problematic, some people might say, to say that anybody who insists on equality is a problem. But I think what Nietzsche's saying here is, and I think what's really important here is that this isn't a question of equality before the law. It's a question of equality amongst each other. The fact of the matter is that none of us are equal to one another. We're all our own individual selves. We've all got our individual strengths. And the second we try to level ourselves down or level someone else down to match us or whatnot, we do ourselves a disservice, right? The goal here isn't to be equal to one another. It's to find what makes you better than everybody else and to lean into it, right? To find your thing, your Nietzsche, if you will. Yes, I went there, okay? And to kind of really focus in on that, right? Second, the secret of realizing the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment of existence is to live dangerously. Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius. Send your ships out into uncharted seas. Live in conflict with your equals and yourselves. In other words, folks, don't settle on who you are. Living life isn't a matter of settling. It's a matter of going out and challenging life. So this is a question of what actually constitutes living, right? Things can be alive without living a life, right? We all know that one friend who's very, very safe about things. And, it's kind of a boring way of being. Um, Nietzsche would say that, especially in your young life, you should be going out and challenging things, okay? Because that's where life really occurs, okay? And remember, this is all what, existential philosophy is about. That's why Nietzsche, when we get to him, he's going to be very critical of hyper-religious people, because he's going to say that the hyper-religious person is actually a life-denying person. If you're so concerned with the afterlife that you don't live life now, then you've actually thrown what you have away. So this is all part of the existential tree, and I think it's something that we should be considering a little bit more deeply as we move forward. Now, two more slides, and that's where this lecture is going to end. Okay, we're going to talk about freedom and responsibility. Now, I do not have the terms here. Okay, but one other term I want you to get, and this is going to be in our chat window. Okay. I got a typo in there, but that's okay. Okay, folks, one thing you need to get used to over the next couple of weeks is the identification of syzygies, right? SYZYGY, or a necessary pairing of opposites. If you think about it, there are necessary pairing of opposites all over the place. North sides of the mountain, south side of the mountain, black, white, hot, cold, war, peace, heads, tails, good, bad. These are all syzygies, right? And freedom and responsibility is a syzygy, okay? What we need to understand is that part of the freedom and responsibility syzygy is, freedom and responsibility, that is the core of the individual existence as we know it, right? It's the qualitative variable of our lives. And if we think about it, it really depends on the degree to which we have either one of these things is going to depend on what you think about our reality. So someone like Jean-Paul Sartre would think that we were absolutely free, right? That's not necessarily something I believe, but it's something that I think, we have to consider. If we're absolutely free, then we're ultimately responsible. Or someone like Martin Heidegger would think that we are thrown into the world. In fact, there's this idea from his philosophy called thrownness, and it talks about just having this kind of arbitrary conditions to our existence. Okay. The fact of the matter is that for each one of these thinkers, as it pertains to responsibility and freedom, every one of these thinkers is going to say something to the effect of, we don't like to be free. Okay. And like I said, for Sartre, that leads to this idea of bad faith. Okay. Bad faith is this idea of making petty excuses for why we don't live the way we want to do, or why we don't live the way we want to live. Whereas Heidegger is going to say that we're simply going to act inauthentic in moments where we are, otherwise poised to be free. You go to the gas station, and as opposed to having a prolonged conversation with somebody about, their life, what do? You ask them about the weather and how work is today. You don't really care about those things. You know what your answers are going to be. Basically, it's just there to kind of, make the time go by faster, right? It's idle chat, right? And Kierkegaard himself is going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about this in the next lecture, which is the idea of the crowd, right? Basically, as opposed to doing things to be authentic, to be an individual, you're going to do things in such ways to basically just blend in with the crowd, okay? And the point of this is all the fact that, folks, if we try to be free at every given moment, right? If we try to be ultimately responsible at every given moment, right? Life would become very, very unmanageable. I think each one of these thinkers are going to be very clear about the fact that that's difficult and sometimes not even preferable, but it's something we need to at least be conscious about. And that's something that Kierkegaard is at least going to lean into, this idea that we need to be conscious about, our moment-to-moment freedom, okay? We're also going to talk about change and transcendence, right? Folks, the fact of the matter is that you do exist on multiple planes of existence, right? You know this, right? I mean, even if you think about it, you have multiple identities at any given point, right? You are yourself in your, conscious sense of yourself, but you're also yourself as a family member. You're yourself as a student. You're yourself as a member of society. And the fact of the matter is that those are all separate layers of who you are, right? So yeah, you need to be very, very conscious about that. Now, we're not going to get too deep into this slide. In fact, I'm going to call it right here. But I want to leave you off with that, okay? These are the major themes of existential philosophy, and these are the things that we're going to be discussing over the next couple of weeks. So with that being said, if anybody has any questions or concerns, I'm going to stop sharing this now. Yep, stop presenting. Okay. Please go ahead and email me. I'm going to get this uploaded as quickly as possible, and we'll move on from there. Okay, folks. Have a good day. Bye.